Last time we talked about how the New Deal essentially ended in 1938 when a conservative bloc formed in Congress of Southern Democrats and Republicans who refused to approve any more domestic legislation. However, by 1938, President Roosevelt himself was increasingly focusing on foreign affairs because the world was about to erupt in flames again. Roosevelt seemed to realize much sooner than most Americans that the rise of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan represented a threat to world peace, and that included the safety and security of the United States. Most Americans in the 30s, however, wanted to do everything possible to make sure that the United States did not get sucked into another world war. And among other things, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts in the 1930s which attempted to tie the president's hands with regard to foreign policy. Roosevelt watched the international situation with increasing concern. And of course, when the Germans invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and began World War II in Europe, it had actually started earlier in Asia with the Japanese invasion of China, Roosevelt realized that the United States had to do everything short of all-out involvement in the war to keep the British especially afloat, particularly after the fall of France in the spring of 1940. The Germans, of course, attempted to bomb Britain into submission in the summer of 1940, the so-called Battle of Britain, and all of this is taking place in the midst of a presidential election year. Roosevelt decided to seek an unprecedented third term in 1940, partly because he enjoyed being president, but partly because he felt that this was no time for on-the-job training, that with the world in flames, the nation needed an experienced hand at the wheel. The Republicans nominated a former Democrat, Wendell Willkie of Indiana, in 1940. The big issue in 1940 really was whether or not the United States would continue to do everything that it could to support the British. Roosevelt had already agreed to trade 50 old U.S. Navy destroyers to the British in return for 99-year leases on naval and air bases in Newfoundland, Bermuda, and the West Indies. Congress had also approved the first peacetime draft in American history. But many Americans were still very reluctant to do anything that might suck the United States into the war. Roosevelt made it clear that he believed the U.S. had to give all-out aid to Britain short of actually committing combat troops, and Willkie basically agreed. So without a clear-cut alternative, the voters decided to stick with the experienced Roosevelt and elected him to an unprecedented third term in office. Although his margin of victory was much smaller than in 1932 or 1936, Roosevelt still won re-election fairly easily, and he saw his re-election as a mandate to provide even more aid to Great Britain. In his annual message to Congress in January 1941, Roosevelt asked Congress to approve a program known as Lend-Lease. The Lend-Lease bill would give the president the authority to lend, lease, or otherwise dispose of war materials to any country whose defense he deemed vital to the defense of the United States. Since this clearly meant Great Britain, Lend-Lease was a decidedly belligerent act on the part of a supposedly neutral country, and it set off the most bitter chapter in the great debate over American involvement in the war. It was indeed a very bitter debate, but after 2 months, Congress did vote to approve the Lend-Lease bill. A turning point in the war came in June of 1941 when Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union. Although anti-Soviet feeling in the United States was intense, Roosevelt was able to convince Congress that any enemy of Hitler was a friend of ours, and Congress responded by extending Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union as well. In August of 1941, Roosevelt met British leader Winston Churchill in secret off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. The two leaders issued what became known as the Atlantic Charter, which was essentially a statement of war aims. And so the United States had committed itself to the defeat of Nazi Germany without officially being at war. But to all intents and purposes, the United States was already involved in an undeclared naval war with Germany anyway. Congress had essentially repealed the Neutrality Acts in November of 1941 by authorizing American merchant ships to be armed and allowing them to enter combat zones in belligerent ports. German submarines were attacking American ships, and the American ships were firing back. Yet it was not this so-called Battle of the Atlantic that brought the United States officially into the war. Rather, it was the expansion of the Japanese Empire in the Pacific. Neither Japan nor the United States really wanted a war, but actions by both sides brought on a showdown. The United States was inflexible in its demands that Japan withdraw from China and Southeast Asia, and the Japanese military blundered badly in deciding that they had to eliminate the American Navy and seize the Philippines before continuing their program of conquest in Asia. And so shortly before 8 a.m. on Sunday, December 7, 1941, Japanese planes struck the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, the attackers sank or heavily damaged 8 American battleships and several other vessels and destroyed more than 150 American airplanes on the ground. More than 3,000 American personnel were killed or wounded. Pearl Harbor was the most devastating defeat in American military history. The only bright spot for the United States was that its aircraft carriers were out on a mission at the time of the attack and were thus saved from destruction, and the fact that the Japanese did not do significant damage to the port facilities or the fuel storage tanks. The next day, Roosevelt went before Congress to ask for a declaration of war against Japan. He said, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." The Senate voted for war unanimously. The vote in the House was 388 to 1. So the United States is now officially at war, and as Roosevelt himself said, Dr. New Deal now became Dr. Win the War. On December 11th, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declared war against the United States. This might have been one of Hitler's biggest mistakes, because even though there was rage against Japan for the Pearl Harbor attack, many Americans still did not want to get involved in a war against Germany and Italy. Nevertheless, by the end of 1941, the U.S. is officially at war against Germany, Italy, and Japan.